how can we sustain high performance? There's some interesting learnings, I think, from sport, particularly endurance sport, that apply equally well to the endurance activity that many of us feel we're engaged in the workplace. The first principle is that we need to work both efficiently and effectively. Secondly, we need to be decisive and focused. We heard a lot about focus this morning in that first presentation from Craig. And finally, ideally, we need to be both energized as well as well rested. We're going to explore each of those three topics today. But unfortunately, many of us struggle with those three pillars of sustained performance. How many people here feel truly efficient and effective? Well, according to some data, working hours are up by about 13%. However, 64% of employees say that they still struggle to get their work done. There must be something wrong with that equation, right? Do you feel decisive and focused? Well, according to some other data, we're interrupted once every 11 minutes. Maybe you're lucky to get 11 minutes, but that's not the worst part of that story. Once we've been interrupted, it then takes 23 minutes to get back up to speed on the original task. Do you feel energized? Do you feel well rested? Well, about a fifth of people feel that they've got some type of symptoms of burnout at the average organization. The good news is it doesn't have to be this way. In fact, we can use some principles from performance science to sustain high performance. And we're going to talk about these three principles today. The first, we're going to look at how we can reduce some of the inefficiency that steals so much of our time. Secondly, we're going to talk about increasing that decisiveness and focus. And finally, we're going to be talking about boosting energy and improving recovery. To do this, I'm going to introduce you to a framework. I mentioned I used to be very involved in cycling. I was a full-time racing cyclist. If you've done any kind of endurance sport, you might be familiar with this idea of training zones. You might use a heart rate monitor, for example, to measure the intensity of your effort when you're swimming, cycling, or running. I'd like you to imagine that you could apply a similar approach to knowledge work, to cognitive work. And this is an approach that I describe as cognitive gears. So I'd like you to imagine for a moment, over here there is a high cognitive gear. This represents the time that you spend focusing on that high-impact, high-priority work, ideally not being interrupted or distracted. In the middle, we've got a middle cognitive gear. This is the time that we spend switching between tasks, doing the busy work. This morning we heard about this idea that busyness is not productivity. Well, middle gear really represents that time. And then over here, I'd like you to imagine that we've got this low cognitive gear. And this low cognitive gear represents proactive recovery. It might describe that we spend resting, recovering, perhaps even reflecting. But if you were to reflect for a moment and consider, where do you spend most of your time during the average day? I think unfortunately, many of us find that we spend most of our day stuck in a cognitive middle gear that's spent task switching, doing emails, feeling like a lot of the time we're stuck on someone else's schedule. You see, there's a battle for our attention, and it's getting worse. Over the last 2.5 years, the average attention span has dropped from 2.5 minutes to just 47 seconds. 70% of emails are opened within 6 seconds of receiving them. 42% of people admit to checking email and replying in the bathroom. I'm sure you're all laughing because you know someone. I'm sure no one here would do such a terrible thing. But overall, the evidence is pretty clear. The more time we spend on email, the higher our stress, the lower our productivity.